Hey, Dog Nation, I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Kroger, and we're happy to have you with us as we get ready for a huge football weekend. We're going to be tonight on Peachtree TV, showing you Buford and Walton. I'm looking forward to being a part of that call. Obviously, five-star running back Justice Haynes factors mightily into the storyline for that second-round 7A playoff game. And obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about Haynes on today's show here, too, about what seems to be a little bit of movement and the possibility the door maybe just slightly ajar here for Georgia to get involved still in his recruitment or maybe remain involved in all that. We'll give you some thoughts on that and then let you hear Jeff Sentell on that before we're all said and done. We'll also kind of backtrack a little bit with Jeff and talk about the decommitment that Georgia suffered this week, what exactly all of that means, and some rumors about, guys trading away from UGA, maybe trading towards UGA. We'll see if we can cover all the bases with all of that here over the course of our time, and we're certainly excited about all of that. Also, getting ready for Georgia, Kentucky on Saturday. That is a very big deal, too, and we are go for two in 22, and a huge, huge announcement as it relates to that. We're going to do that on the show today there as well. We're going to pack a bunch of stuff in here, cram it in, and try to create some good vibes to go into a Friday with the Dogs getting ready to go on the road in freezing cold Lexington against those Kentucky Wildcats tomorrow. So what do you say we get it started? It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It's presented by Kroger, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
All right, coming up in a couple of minutes, I've got a little bit of a brief thought I want to give you on five-star running back Justice Haynes about what might be going on with his recruitment, where it seems like the door is sort of open here for something to occur, and yet there's not a huge level of tangible evidence that's actually happening, but somehow, some way, people are still talking about it. We'll give you some thoughts on that here coming up in a moment before we see Justice tonight on Peachtree TV as Buford gets ready to take on Walton, a game that I'm looking forward to having the call for you on. We'll do that later on tonight. But first, there's this. Georgia obviously going on the road Saturday to take on the Kentucky Wildcats, and it becomes another chapter in what has been a very interesting story in college football this season involving Georgia quarterback Stetson Bennett. And the sense that you get here is that there are a lot of people kind of outside the bubble of Dog Nation that are sort of noticing what's going on with Bennett, and I think they are working hard to sort of properly quantify exactly what this season means for him and exactly what the, perception of Stetson Bennett should be. For instance, there's this Heisman tracker thing that ESPN does. And this week, when they kind of put back out their Heisman stuff, on their list of Heisman candidates in order, likelihood of winning the award, they had Stetson Bennett 5th. Now, here's the thing you should understand, is that it used to be there were kind of a different number of Heisman finalists every year. One year you might have 3, one year you might have 6. Or I don't know if there's ever that many, but it's been kind of a fluctuating number, as few as 3, as many as, a good bit more than that. And it just sort of depends on the context of that year for how many Heisman finalists there are. Last year, though, the Heisman kind of started a new era in which going forward they were always going to have 4. So if we take ESPN at its word that Bennett is right now 5th in all of that, behind C.J. Stroud and Drake May and Hendon Hooker and Caleb Williams, then it is at least conceivable. I don't think at this point in time Bennett can win the award, I don't believe, but it is at least conceivable that, hey, we don't know how USC is going to perform down the stretch. Drake May is still the North Carolina quarterback, and you're not quite so sure how much people are really paying attention to him, even though NFL draft scouts are obviously watching very closely here. And you could kind of go on and on with other guys there as well, that it's at least conceivable that Bennett could still make a push over the course of the remainder of the season to actually finish as a Heisman finalist. It's not my prediction to say that he will. It's also not really my prediction to say that he won't. I don't know that I have a good handle on exactly how all of this kind of goes right now, because I think that Heisman voters can be a little bit difficult to predict. But I think you've got to take ESPN, which published this story a little earlier this week. I think you've got to take them at their word right now that Bennett is at least in the mix for consideration here at the moment. So let me read you a quote here. This coming from the ESPN writers and their kind of Heisman tracker kind of write-up about where guys stand for the Heisman Trophy here right now. This is ESPN on Stetson Bennett. And I think the way in which they compliment Bennett here, if you're a Georgia fan, this is sort of exactly the thing you want to hear. This is the kind of thing you want to be true about your quarterback. But I think this probably also kind of sums up Bennett pretty well there also. So this is ESPN on Bennett. He might not have head-turning numbers, But Bennett has earned his spot, meaning where he is in the Heisman race right now, because of his toughness in big games. He had standout performances against Georgia's 2 ranked opponents this season, then number 11 Oregon, and then number 1 Tennessee. Now, if I told you in any given year you could have something be said about your quarterback, what would you want to be true about your quarterback? Whether it's 5 years ago, 20 years from now, anytime in the past, the future, whatever else, you would love for your quarterback to be known as a guy who plays not big, but tough in big games. Don't you love that description? That Stetson Bennett is tough in big games. And by the way, on Saturday against Kentucky, another example in which he's going to go head-to-head against a quarterback that has far more fame, far more attention than he does. NFL draft scouts, for whatever reason, seem to love Will Levis. I have no idea why. I've never seen Levis play a good game, ever. And yet, nonetheless, NFL draft scouts fall all over themselves to praise him all the time. And yet, once again, this will be a spot where Bennett can kind of outplay a quarterback who's gotten a lot more attention than he has coming into that game. And as the ESPN folks said, Bennett was at his best this year in games that sort of mattered most. To begin the season against Oregon, obviously in the showdown of the century against Tennessee. And that is a little bit of a continuation from what it would have been like, say, last year when he was MVP of the game against Michigan in the Orange Bowl, one of those games that should not be lost to history here. Georgia played amazing that day in a game in which a lot of the world sort of thought they were going to lose, and yet Bennett's performance a big reason why they didn't. And obviously the national championship game against Alabama, another example of that, where Bennett has been, as the ESPN writer says, very tough in big games. And so you're kind of left to conclude, sort of left to wonder, well, if that's what ESPN is saying, is the Heisman voter class, are they really noticing this? Are they really paying attention to this? And, I got one of the questions this week for Gimme 5. Somebody said, is Stetson Bennett the best story of all time in college football? Is this the best story ever? And I thought that was kind of an interesting way to sort of frame this as it relates to Bennett. I forgot who asked me the question. I apologize for not giving credit, but I thought it was a good question. I didn't have a chance to answer it in the story that I wrote, but I was thinking about it a lot this week. And I've always been kind of fascinated by Walt Disney, and one of the things that Walt Disney used to say is one of his rules for storytelling is that you can only tell one story at a time. And I think part of the issue with Stetson Bennett, one of the reasons why sometimes Bennett's misunderstood, one of the reasons sometimes maybe Bennett is sort of mischaracterized is I think that Bennett sometimes has the look of a little bit different story being told simultaneous to the other story that's being told about Georgia football. Bennett kind of has the feel of an underdog. He's once again kind of one of the finalists for the Bullsworth Award, or how you said the Bullsworth, whatever the trophy is for the walk-on. He's obviously well known as a former walk-on. He's a little bit of an underdog figure on a team in Georgia that's anything but that. The Georgia team overall is 5 stars across the board everywhere. Georgia overall is sort of unmatched strength in sort of every single area. And by comparison, Stetson Bennett, as the former walk-on, is a little bit of a different story being told simultaneous to the other story being told about Georgia football. And those conflicting stories, I think, become confusing sometimes for some people, quite possibly even Heisman Trophy voters themselves. But nonetheless, Bennett's going to have a couple more chances to impress. I don't know how many people are watching Georgia-Kentucky on Saturday, but this is a data point. I certainly think even fewer people will be watching Georgia versus Georgia Tech next Saturday, but that is another data point. And then finally, on a championship Saturday when Hendon Hooker won't be playing, and it remains to be seen if Caleb Williams is going to be playing, and it remains to be seen how well Drake May will play going against the Clemson defense. Stetson Bennett does have a chance to play on that Saturday and be, as ESPN says, strong once again, tough once again in the biggest games that Georgia plays. And assuming that some of these Heisman voters have still held on to their vote, assuming that some of them used that championship Saturday as another opportunity to make their evaluation, then maybe by the time it's all said and done, Stetson Bennett really could put himself in consideration to be in New York as a Heisman finalist. I think that would be a great final chapter in what has certainly been an amazing story for him here at the University of Georgia. Now, shifting gears and talking about something completely different here for a moment. I want to talk about 5-star running back Justice Haynes here. And when Jeff Sintel is on the show here in a moment, we're going to ask Jeff more about Justice Haynes. We talked about Justice a good bit with Jeff last week. And admittedly, part of this is kind of on my mind because Haynes is going to be on TV with me tonight. We're going to broadcast his game on Peachtree TV as Buford gets ready to take on Walton. But here's the other thing that you can't help but notice, which is there seems to be something sort of going on here with Haynes. Jeff Sintel, on the heels of the visit that Justice took to Georgia for the Tennessee game, after many, many weeks on our show, because I've asked Jeff about Justice 8 million times. A lot of y'all like to joke about the recruit that I'm trying to speak into existence. I don't think there's any doubt that the recruit for this cycle that I'm trying to speak into existence, I'm trying to will to happen here, I don't think there's any doubt that's Justice Haynes. And when I've asked Jeff about Haynes before, there has been the thought of, I'm talking about going back previous weeks, no, there's no chance. He's going to Alabama. He's definitely going to Alabama. He's definitely going to Alabama. And yet when Jeff wrote about Justice after the Tennessee visit for that big, huge game, all of a sudden then Jeff's stance had completely softened. All of a sudden then Jeff's belief about Justice Haynes maybe being in play for Georgia, that seemed to be a lot more realistic based on what Jeff wrote. You'll remember we talked about this at the time. We even asked Jeff about that last week. And yet here's the other thing that I'm noticing there too. Is if you look at some of the other major recruiting sites, and yes, there are other people that cover recruiting. If you look at some of the other major recruiting sites, the chatter on those sites sort of seems to reflect the same kind of deal here of, hey, maybe it could happen. Let's see. Yeah, nobody wants to quite go on the record and say, yep, Justice is flipping from Alabama to Georgia. But if you really follow like well-respected thought leaders in the recruiting industry, you don't really see very many people right now who reject it as a possibility. It seems like this is growing in its likelihood of at least being a real conversation. Now, what I find to be interesting about that is if you look at some recent publicly available comments from Haynes himself, you don't really see any evidence why that'd be the case. You really don't. I mean, like Justice is a very polished recruit. I mean, his dad, obviously, Veron Haynes, former NFL guy, great former Georgia Bulldog. This is a family that's well positioned to handle the recruiting part of all of this and handle it very smoothly. And when Justice gives an interview, he's very, very careful. This is very, very well thought out. There are no slip-ups. There are no reveals. There is nothing that Justice says that gets him in trouble with Alabama folks or makes a Georgia fan believe he's got no chance of doing this. By the way, Ohio State just had a big running back decommitment. Maybe the Buckeyes are back in play on all of this too. So there just seems to be a lot of something going on with Haynes, and yet none of it seems to be, as best I can tell, based on publicly available information. So you're left to wonder, does that mean there's something behind the scenes? Does that mean that there's something we don't know about? Does that mean that there's some energy here kind of based on something that's either always been in place or just kind of being recently reignited because of how special it was to have been in the stadium for Georgia-Tennessee and that great moment when obviously the Georgia-Tennessee game is always special to the Haynes family because that's the moment in which Veron Haynes back in 2001 etched himself into the history books forever. And we've had Veron Haynes on our show a million times over the years. We were talking to him about Justice Haynes on this show like when Justice Haynes was barely even in high school. When he was just kind of getting out of middle school, we were already talking to Veron Haynes about Justice Haynes here on this show. And when you listen to Veron Haynes and his own memories of having played at Georgia, you know how much this program means to him. Even with his son committed to Alabama, that's still true. You have every reason to believe that's the case. In fact, I want to go back to last year, going into the game against Tennessee, remembering what it was like. Because last year, I guess, would have been the 20th anniversary, right? Yeah. Last year would have been the 20th anniversary of the Hobnail boot. We had Veron on the show. We've had him on many times. And he talked on the show with us about how much that sort of hobnail boot moment meant for him and being connected forever to the great and legendary call by Larry Munson. This is the dad of a five-star running back, and what he said a year ago about Georgia, maybe it still means something now. This is Veron Haynes from last year.
Listen, let me tell you something. You have one of the most legendary voices make a call that he didn't particularly know what he had did that day.
Right.
Because as the funny story goes, I only share this when I'm golfing usually, but Larry Munson is getting interviewed in the locker room by CBS after the game, and they first words out of their mouth was, "Hey, Mr. Munson, by the way, what is a hobnail boot?" And he's smoking his cigar, and he's like, "The hell if I know." On national TV, it was epic.
So you listen to Veron Haynes tell that story. He clearly enjoys it, and he clearly has very many happy memories of having been a part of such a historic moment for this program. How could you not? Of course you would love that forever. And of course you would dine out on a tale like that for the rest of your life and regale friends and colleagues on the golf course with you know what you were a part of. Of course you would do that. And Georgia fans still cheer loudly every time that thing is shown as part of the pregame video package at the beginning of games. of course there's still a little bit of an emotional pull for that. And Justice Haynes, having been in Athens for the Georgia-Tennessee game the other day, of course that had to be on his mind and on his family's mind and everything else. So here's the bottom line for this. I have no idea how this is going to turn out. And it's not my intention here to tell you that Georgia's going to flip Justice Haynes away from Alabama. That is not my intention. If anything, I'm sort of looking at my watch and think, gosh, the clock is really ticking here. If all goes according to plan, Justice will be living in Tuscaloosa within a matter of a couple of weeks. That all of this is very late, and all of this is seemingly very, down to the wire. But somebody somewhere seems to think something. And nobody seems to be really all that willing to kind of say what it is that's causing them to feel the way they feel. But there's no doubt there's a little something in the air here. And it doesn't exist for, like, say, Caleb Downs. That's another in-state prospect who chose Alabama over Georgia. Nobody says this about Downs. This isn't Georgia fans thinking we get everybody. That's not what this is. There is something in play here for Haynes. It doesn't seem to be in play for anybody else. You can't help but notice, and it may end badly. It may not turn out to be what Georgia fans want it to be. But as you tune in tonight to watch him on Peachtree TV, you can't be completely closed off to the notion that before it's all said and done, that maybe Justice Haynes really will be a dog, as a lot of us think it always should have been. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Kroger, and we are glad to have you with us. No matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, or on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast, no matter where you find them. Apple, Spotify, worldfamousdawgnation.com. Like, there's just so many different platforms we try to make our show available on, and we want to make sure you know about them all. We got a huge show coming up, and obviously we're so appreciative of our friends at Kroger for making it all possible. They just do a great job for us, and we're obviously loving this time of year as you head towards crunch time in the college football season, but also the nearing the end of the football season means getting close to the holiday season. And when it comes to the great stuff that are going to be going on around your table this upcoming Thanksgiving, which, by the way, is next week, our friends at Kroger have you covered for all of that. So if you check out the website, Kroger.com/Thanksgiving, you can learn more about this, whether it be the big turkey, the main dish, or the great sides, or any of that kind of stuff. All of that right now for you at your local Kroger. So check out the website, Kroger.com/Thanksgiving. That's Kroger.com/Thanksgiving. And you can get all of that great savings, good food, the special memories that get made around the dinner table this time of year. Kroger has got you ready to go to be ready for all of that. So check them out today. Just stop by and see them in store, or check out Kroger.com/Thanksgiving for a lot more on that. All right, speaking of Justice Haynes, we'll talk to Jeff Sentell about justice and a whole lot more here coming up in just a little bit. And we're going to kind of get more into the Georgia-Kentucky game here in a moment there too. But before that, though, I got my Go for 2 and 22 t-shirt on. I am so excited about this, and so excited about a big announcement I want to make with all of you here right now. You've been asking for it, and we try to do what you ask for as much as we possibly can. So as another way of kind of continuing our kickoff of Go for 2 22 season, we're going to have a big Go for 2 and 22 event coming up in a couple of weeks at the Marlowe's Tavern in Brookhaven. So a big chance for all of Dog Nation to get back together again to create the great vibes that are required, the great vibes necessary for a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful big event here. So we're going to be at the Marlowe's in Brookhaven. Now, the address here for this is 3575 Durden Drive. That's 3575 Durden Drive. And for what it's worth, when we did our kickoff event for the season back at Marlowe's, that was the Marlowe's in Dunwoody. We're going to be at the Marlowe's in Brookhaven this time around. So a little bit different Marlowe's location than we were at the last time we were there. So for those of you who came to Marlowe's for the first time back in August, just know this is a new Marlowe's location for you. Now, we've been there many times over the years, but if you're new to us, this is going to be our first time this year being at the Marlowe's in Brookhaven. So it's 3575 Durden Drive. It's going to be on Wednesday, November 30th at 6 p.m. We're going to be talking about the SEC Championship game. We're going to be getting ready for Go for 2 and 22 season, and we want you to be a part of it. It starts at 6 p.m. there that night. So you're going to be hearing us say a lot about this. One of those great chances for us to all get together, do some face-to-face Georgia conversation, big Q&A. Who knows what kind of special surprises we could have over the course of the next couple of weeks as it relates to this. But it's going to be a massive event Wednesday, November 30th, leading to the SEC Championship. Our Go for 2 and 22 preview event, 6 p.m., the Marlowe's in Brookhaven, 3575 Durden Drive. We want to see you there. Can't wait for that. Now, let's go around the doghouse. And it's presented today by our friends at Berkshire Hathaway Home Services. And I was doing some reading this morning on the Georgia-Kentucky game. And sometimes I like to read sort of outside DawgNation's boundaries as a way of just kind of trying to find out what other people are saying. And I was looking at the story at CBS Sports. There's a guy named Jerry Palm. Jerry Palm's been around the sort of college football space for what seems like 1,000 years. Used to be a big BCS guy, used to be a big RPI guy for college basketball, and now there is no BCS. There's essentially no RPI anymore. So a lot of the stuff he was originally sort of famous for, he's kind of had to sort of shift his approach to things a little bit, but he's always been kind of a little bit of a numbers-based college sports observer. And he was making some predictions for some games of the weekend. He was talking about the Georgia-Kentucky game, and one of the things he mentioned was about how basically what Georgia has been like since its game against Missouri. A lot of you got to remember all this, that the Georgia-Missouri game, was obviously a game in which Georgia was, kind of in a fight for its life almost the entirety of the game. And for a while, it even seemed like Georgia might lose that day, to Missouri. We all kind of remember that. And it was one of those moments in which the game was over. I think there were some people who were kind of left to wonder, well, gosh, is Georgia not as good as we thought they were if this is what they're doing in a road spot like this against Missouri? I mean, if you need a reminder here, the score that day, 26-22. Georgia was 20-plus point favorite, approaching almost 30-point favorite status on the road there in that game, and actually had to fight to win it. 26-22 was the final. And yet, in retrospect, it sort of seems like, and obviously sometimes after the fact, a lot of things seem true that may not have felt true in the moment, but in retrospect, isn't it kind of true, and this is relevant as Georgia gets ready to go on the road again on Saturday, that actually instead of being an example of, hey, this maybe proves that Georgia's not quite what it should be, that the Missouri game almost looks like the galvanizing moment in which Georgia actually fully became what it's supposed to be, that whatever happened there that day and whatever Georgia did to cause itself to make that game far harder than it needed to be, would you not all acknowledge that Georgia's been on a very different run since then, winning 42-10 against Auburn, 55-0 against Vanderbilt, a Vanderbilt team, by the way, that just beat Kentucky, winning by 22 against Florida, scoring 42 in the process, dominating then number one ranked Tennessee to win 27-13, going on the road last week, handling business in relatively comfortable fashion against Mississippi State, winning 45-19. That sometimes we see these moments for teams where, hey, this was the game that was the wake-up call. This is the game that kind of showed you that, hey, you better tighten up your process here. You better get focused. You better get as intense as you need to be so that you can fully achieve all the potential that exists for you, as we kind of call it here, go for 2 in 22. The seeds may have been truly planted to go for 2 in 22 in an otherwise ugly game against Missouri. The last few games sort of give you the sense that might be true. And I've told you this week I've been a little bit anxious, a little bit on pins and needles here, and it's certainly not a prediction that I think that Kentucky is going to win the game or that it's even going to be all that close. But for someone like me who, kind of has had some of that of, what could go wrong, or, tricky spot for Georgia, or even maybe lingering memories when happened against Missouri. I think even someone like me who's kind of talked about that some here this week, I think it's important to note the way in which this Georgia team is talking right now, the conversation they seem to be having about themselves and seemingly with themselves, and the confidence that seems to have been born in this team over the course of the last few weeks. In fact, I was listening to Georgia running back Kenny McIntosh this week, and I think this is a great example of what Georgia is now compared to what maybe Georgia was, a lesser version of itself when it went to Missouri several weeks ago. That day, it was the Missouri crowd that was loud the entire time. It was that day a Georgia team that's really pretty inexperienced, at least at the moment it was, that seemed to not quite know how to handle itself there in that particular situation, and as we've said, was kind of lucky to be able to pull out a win. It seemed like for a moment they might actually lose. But since then, it's dominating the game at Mississippi State. It's kind of, completely neutralizing that crowd, seeing Georgia fans everywhere, and the feeling for Georgia on the road now so different than what it was when Georgia went back to Columbia, Missouri, going back several weeks ago. And in fact, when you listen to McIntosh this week, it almost sounds like this Georgia team is eager to be on the road, to see how many of their fans travel to see them up there into freezing cold Lexington, but also have a chance to do again this Saturday what it did last Saturday, which is completely take the home crowd out of the game. This is great stuff from Kenny McIntosh. Take a listen to it.
And Georgia fans, just for them to be able to travel wherever we go is crazy. And hearing the other fans be quiet after we go out there and do what we do, that's what gives me, excitement and bring our team excitement.
Don't you love that? Hearing the other fans get quiet. Hearing an away stadium when everybody's breathing down your neck and trying to be loud and trying to make it tough on you, hearing them completely taken out of the game, that's seemingly what fuels Kenny McIntosh right now. And if he's saying that about himself, you better believe a lot of other Georgia fans, or I should say Georgia players, are saying that about themselves too. The point here is this, is that there's no doubt this is a more confident Georgia team now than it was when it went to Columbia, Missouri several weeks ago. And I don't mean overconfident. I don't mean rat poison. I don't mean reading their own press clippings. I don't mean anything like that. There is a certain version of confidence that actually is fuel, that you're actually fueled by your belief that you're supposed to be here. You're fueled by your belief that this is simply nothing more than the next step. And yes, there are bigger steps to be taken, but you can't take those steps today. You can only take this step today. And there's a certain understanding of that is kind of fueled also, I believe, by confidence. So for Georgia fans like myself who are like, ooh, a little anxious right now, kind of waiting for Go for 2 in 22 season to be here, biding time before you get there, borrowing the confidence of these Georgia players themselves might not actually be all that bad of an idea, because this team has been locked in, and you get no indication this week that they are any less locked in now than they were before. Their toughness has been challenged by Kentucky. They get a chance to go out and once again prove that they are the more physical team. They're the stronger team. They're the better team on this and every Saturday. And that may be all the motivation that UGA needs. Good stuff there from Kenny McIntosh, and that is Around the Doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Berkshire Hathaway Home Services. And once again, Georgia not at home on Saturday, on the road. But we all know how important home is, and we all know what the dreams are like when a new home is the thing that you're after, whether it be to get closer to work or move closer to family or just sort of stretch out. A lot of times one of the things I hear is, for a lot of people, hey, my family's growing. I need my house to kind of grow to keep up with what my family is it has kind of become here. Well, whatever your reason for a new beginning is, our friends at Berkshire Hathaway Home Services believe the best time for new beginnings is right now. And that's not just when it comes to your residential real estate purchases. You may think about commercial purchase here too, because, look, you got a business, but maybe your business could thrive even more with the proper storefront, or to get closer to where the customers are. And there are also commercial real estate opportunities for you to think about here too. Plus, it's a great time to become an investor. We love real estate investing, and we just believe that that's a great avenue for you to explore there as well. And our friends at Berkshire Hathaway Home Service, they know all about that there as well. So they've got offices all across our area. They've got so many agents who are just so brilliant when it comes to really being transaction experts, to understand how you go from contract to closing table and leading you to a satisfactory outcome. So check them out online. It's bhhsgeorgia.com. That is bhhsgeorgia.com. Our friends at Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, they bring Around the Doghouse to us here today. All right, before we're done, we'll have our picks for the big games of the weekend, including the Georgia game against Kentucky. I'll give you a couple of data points to consider there on that. And a couple of SEC games that may not be on your radar that definitely should be for some very interesting reasons. We'll talk about that here too. But before that, on everything as it relates to UGA recruiting, including the possibility of still getting in on the 5-star running back Justice Haynes, let's cover all of that with Jeff Sintel as we go on the road with him today, assisted by AAA.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We'll say hello to Jeff Sintel here on the road, assisted by AAA here today on DawgNation Daily. And, Jeff, I was talking about this before you joined us, and I know you and I talked about this last week, and you've written about this at DawgNation.com there as well. This idea that it may not be completely over yet for Georgia when it comes to Justice Haynes, who's obviously publicly stating that he's still as committed to Alabama as ever and saying nice things with the Crimson Tide. But what I said, not as a recruiting reporter, because that's not what I do. I'm a recruiting observer. I read other people's reports and kind of follow this the same way that much of our audience does. And the one thing that you can't help but notice is that there are lots of industry chatter right now, a lot of online chatter about something related to Haynes. And the best I can tell is almost none of this is based on anything public, because the Haynes family is very careful about what they say. I just find that to be completely interesting. I find that to be very curious here, that something seems to be going on. And yet if you were, left to kind of draw the arrows on this based on publicly available data, you'd be hard-pressed to kind of find where the evidence is. But yet there just seems to be this feeling in the air that the door is kind of open here. Would you mind talking more about that here a bit?
Yeah, Brandon. Good morning, sir. Good morning, everybody. I think we need to start sponsoring the What About Justice weekly segment here on DawgNation Daily. I'm going to say this. I don't think the door is shut. I don't think the door is totally shut. You're right. The Haynes family is very professional, very measured, very composed. It's going to be probably as hard to get him on the ground tonight in Buford for that huge second-round playoff game at Buford as it is to kind of get him to open up a little bit or even say anything that's going to have folks hitting the F5 button on their computers. I don't think that's the way the Haynes family has ever been, and I don't think that's the way such a mature, composed young man that Justice wants to handle his recruiting. I think that's really probably the best things that need to be said. If it were to happen, Brandon, it's not going to be, public or let's just look at it, Brandon. December the 21st, that's the first day of the early signing period, I believe. It's a little bit later based on the way the calendar falls, I believe. But that's the first day of the early signing period. I don't think Caleb Downs has a lot to do with it. If anything, Caleb Downs' eyes, if they're looking away from Alabama at all, it would probably be to Ohio State, not to Georgia. Perhaps probably the biggest recruiting news I think folks need to really think about is the recent decommitment from Daniel Harris. If folks want to wonder about doors not being shut, doors being closed, I never really kind of thought that Georgia was out of it when the decommitment happened. I thought that this was a recruiting kind of behind the scenes that had a lot of ebbs and flows. And, everybody's going to look at this and say he's a four-star corner. He got scared or he worried about competition. I don't really think that's at all. I think it's a little bit more complicated with a school like Penn State, for example. But make no mistake, Daniel Harris is the type of player that would have played really early at the University of Georgia should he signed, and I still think that's a possibility.
Well, I want to get more to the Harris thing here in a moment because that's obviously a big story here from this week. But you mentioned Ohio State there a moment ago. We've also seen Ohio State deal with a running back decommitment this week too. Is there a chance that Ohio State might still try to be involved in the Haynes story here a bit because all of a sudden the Buckeyes find themselves in need of a running back?
Yeah, that's fascinating, Brandon, as well. They just recently offered Jamarian Wilcox, a guy that tested really well at the MVP camps. He's got legitimate 4.4 times. He's got pretty good production in Georgia high school football, and it's a domino, man. I don't know if you noticed it, but, some of the people on forum.dawgnation.com reached out to me when Mark Fletcher out of American Heritage decommitted recently. He had been a long-time commitment to Ohio State, and people were wondering, is that the missing link here for Georgia? Maybe not Justice, maybe not Jeremiah Cobb, maybe it's Mark Fletcher. Well, my thoughts there would say Florida or Miami, especially Florida with Mark Fletcher. We're seeing Florida get really active on the NIL front, hearing about Florida getting really active on the NIL front. I think they're entertaining Samson Okunlola, five-star offensive tackle, this weekend or recently when got a couple big visits coming up for Samson when everybody would thought he was trending to Miami. Maybe the bloom's off the rose a little bit at Miami. We saw the recent quarterback flip at midnight, Brandon. I don't know if you caught that last week where I think it was like 1 a.m. where Miami's NIL prize quarterback commit flips in the middle of the night from Miami to Florida, and this is for a young man from California. It's getting to be very interesting, and I think one of the things I think we got to be responsible and tell folks about is probably some of the most interesting and important recruiting that's going to take place over the next 21 days or next 30 days leading up to the early signing period. That's not just flips. That's not just decommitments. That's not just guys finding out whether or not they still have valid offers that they're committed to. I think a lot of it's going to be portal recruiting as well. I mean, you hear a lot of stories about, guys looking to move from lots of schools, and it's going to be another crazy part with NIL, and obviously the one-time transfer is still in effect, but you see a lot of talented guys, Brandon, on rosters that kind of aren't playing yet, and those are the ideal candidates to look to even add maybe another layer to another cycle that gets really exciting around these parts.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the portal opens up after the conference championship weekend, and that's going to be – I mean, this is going to be wild. I mean, like we're about to have the wildest December we've ever had with obviously the recruiting class being what it's going to be, and I get the impression there's a lot of drama to come on this class of 2023. Transfer portal stuff. There have been a lot of guys who they've already got one foot in the transfer portal in the SEC, and they may go ahead and jump in with both feet here coming up in a couple of weeks. That's all about to get really crazy, and these coaches have to kind of burn the candle at both ends because they've got to recruit talent to their program, and they're going to have to recruit the talent that is still on their program. They're going to have to do both on that. I think you're probably right. I also think you bring up kind of an interesting point. Let me do a couple things here. First of all, you mentioned Jamarian Wilcox. And listen, I'm not a scout. My opinion on who's who and who's what, it's not worth a dime. I don't even pretend for that to be the case. But I've always liked Jamarian Wilcox, and there's a part of me that wonders, and I've even asked you about Wilcox before, there's a part of me that wonders if Georgia should have recruited him more than they did, especially now that you're saying that Wilcox has got an Ohio State offer here. To me, Wilcox always sort of had the look of a little bit different kind of running back than what Georgia has in the program, and part of me wonders if Georgia shouldn't have given him a longer look.
Valid point. I mean, we got to realize that the Christmas list for Dell McGee, he kind of only shops at the highest end stores, man. The ones that we get worried about when our wives go there. But like, he's got a specific thing. I think Jeremiah Cobb was probably the result of a lot of analysis there on Georgia's part. If it's not Justice, it's probably Jeremiah. And then you see, there's a lot of guys in this state, Brandon, that they took a good look at Georgia, hoping that Georgia would take a really good look at them. That's Wilcox, that's Jordan Louis, the young man that recently decommitted from West Virginia as well. But let me see if I can put one up in your kitchen you haven't seen or heard about yet. Did you notice the recent offer this week from Georgia to a running back prospect primarily out of Charlotte Christian? His name is KJ Kyron Jones. Now, 10.6 speed in the 40, 4.3 speed, 10.6 speed in the 100, excuse me about that, pardon me there. 4.3, 4.38 speed in the 40. The wrinkle here is that Georgia has kind of targeted him to play defensive back, like a safety, like a nickel, things like that. And, what that does for me, these late offers, it tells me that, Georgia's still kicking the tires on that a little bit. But what it also clues me in on is like, okay, not trying to, sideswipe a conversation here, but it also clues me in on, hold on a second, who is at Georgia right now that's like a nickel, like a slot, like a cornerback type, a versatile defensive back that also might not be with the team next year, might be looking elsewhere under those portal pastures we were talking about before. I think that's what makes it really interesting. When you see a public offer late for Georgia to a kid like that, it makes you think two things. It makes you think 2023 class, but it makes you also think 2023 roster in terms of what Georgia might have to backfill at certain positions all across the talent tree there. And, that's that thing about this time of year, Brandon. The late offers here from Georgia, let's say this with a little flair. Georgia's Kirby Smart's specialty of late is to find those senior year bloomers, those guys all of a sudden it's like, wow, got some great senior film. We like this guy a lot. Let's move him up the board. This is the season for that. It's part of the reason why I really enjoy doing what I do is seeing that late development from a lot of players that end up becoming like the Ladd McConkeys on the team, the Jackson Meeks on the team, and so on and so forth.
And to bring this back to Justice Haynes before we move on to the next topic, what's crazy about all of this is that if things stay the way they are now, like Justice will be practicing with Alabama in a few weeks. I mean, these early enrollees typically do some bowl practices, so he's only a few days away from living in Tuscaloosa and only a couple of weeks away from putting on a uniform and going through the paces as Alabama gets ready for the Citrus Bowl or whatever bowl it is they're going to. And I say that half-kiddingly, but the point is that what's crazy about the current recruiting calendar, the way it is now with the early signing period, is that all of this drama happens, I'm talking about like with the shot clock at 4. I mean, we are ticking down to the buzzer here, and yet you get the impression, not just for Georgia and its pursuit of a guy like this, but a lot of these battles where, you may see some pretty heavy-duty flips here, and a lot of this is with the paperwork already kind of signed for the lease, the apartment somewhere else, and yet now you're living in a completely different state, going to a completely different school. It's just amazing how accelerated the timeline is because of the early signing period.
Feels a lot like, I think some of my contemporaries that I respect a great deal, they kind of refer to it as the Wild Wild West, and other guys refer to it as free agency. Other guys refer to it as chaos, and it's a little bit of all that. We can be very descriptive with the adjectives right now, but I think the hard part is for a roster like Georgia, who's trying to not only fill needs for 2023 and recruit some of its guys like they're still uncommitted, because that's what it takes in this NIL era, But then you've also got to figure out, the current roster and then NFL draft perspectives as well. It's kind of like, Kirby and company does a really great job, but they're kind of like Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid here, and that's a very old Western reference for folks that don't get it. But they got roster attrition or roster addition coming from all angles that they got to deal with. At the same time, they're trying to, what is it I've heard? Hashtag go for 2 and 22.
Yeah, there you go.
The boys are earning their money up in Butts-Mehre right now.
All right, so you mentioned Daniel Harris earlier. I want to talk to you about him because he did decommit this week. And when something like this happens, everybody sort of goes into their silos of the typical recruiting talk of, Georgia's recruiting over him, or, good riddance, we don't want him, or, whatever it is that people sort of say on stuff like this. But the sense that I've gotten is, A, because Harris is a very good player, and B, just kind of reading the tea leaves here, is that this was never going to be a recruiting battle that Georgia was going to stop fighting. And it sounds like you're saying the same thing here on that. And maybe the smart money suggests that Georgia may still win this with Harris before it's all said and done. People obviously remember Bear Alexander a year ago, who decommitted from Georgia, and ultimately Georgia still signed him. So I guess my question here is not, do you think there's a chance, because you've already said you do, but what was the reason for the decommit? Do we know? Is it about getting more love shown? Is it about, what people kind of assume now of, hey, you want a little sweeter offer? Like what is the deal for Harris in terms of what led him to open up his recruitment and kind of give you the public decommit here?
Yeah, I think one of the things we got to kind of be responsible about here is there's a lot of intrigue here. Number one, I don't think Georgia is going to be classified as an NIL-heavy school. We've established on your program and in our coverage that the NIL opportunities for Georgia come. And much like Alabama, once they're on the roster and they've earned their spot, that's just a great way to build the team, keep team chemistry right. There's a couple of layers of intrigue. Number one, with Daniel Harris, I think, if Georgia were to get any sort of NIL stuff, it would have to come real late in the process. Like, you never want to be in any business negotiation, right? You never want to be the first bid or the first offer, second offer. You want to come in late.
Don't you know that?
With a competitive offer. And you hear a lot about that, but I think with Daniel Harris, I'm going to stress this. I think, except for maybe A.J. Harris at cornerback, I think everybody else Georgia would be recruiting at defensive back that might be recruiting under Daniel Harris. That's how high on my personal evaluation scale I think of Daniel Harris and what he could be. He's really long, Brandon. He's gone against that South Florida speed a lot that we hold in high regard around these programs and around these parts. But, 6'3", lengthy, just probably needs some weight, Brandon. If you can get him maybe a couple of Thanksgiving dinners, that he might be the type of guy when he gets a little bit more weight on his frame, he might be ready for SEC football a lot faster than most. But man, there's also so much intrigue here, and it's an unknown element with Texas A&M. Don't know if you know this. He has an older brother. Was in the 2020 class. Donnell Harris is his older brother. He was at Texas A&M. For whatever it's worth, I think Jimbo Fisher medically retired him at the beginning of the season in August. Apparently, I don't know how, let's quote Mark Twain here, the rumors of his retirement the rumors of his demise may be exaggerated or premature or whatever. But I do know this. I know Georgia, he's an edge. He was a top 50 player, Brandon, the number 4 edge in the country. But I know this. I know Georgia needs edges, kind of like, I don't know, you need more cool Georgia gear in your closet. I think you've got a whole lot there. But for this, it's like, is Penn State going to offer the 2 scholarships? That's one fancy rumor floating around. And is his brother going to play there? Is that why he wants to play with his brother? I think the rumor mill theater there would be very active. The one thing I will share, concrete, solid information, is that Georgia still wants him. There's still a really strong chance he's at Georgia. And let's just kind of speak Hedges' top targets here. I think I still had him at number 5 on Georgia's top targets list this week, shortly after the decommitment, even though that's so rare how you get a late decommitment and then a recommitment back afterward, just because I think this is a really unique situation.
I want to ask you about some potential bad news for UGA in recruiting, or at least what seems like the festering of possible bad news here. We'll ask you about that here coming up in a moment. I want to remind folks we're on the road, assisted by AAA with Jeff Sintel here today. And, of course, we're traveling a lot this weekend. Jeff and I actually traveling together from Buford tonight and going to go part of the way towards Lexington here this evening, then wake up tomorrow and finish the rest of that drive as we head up to the cold white north in Lexington on a Saturday. And, of course, we're traveling around. I am thankful to have that AAA membership card in my pocket to keep me safe if something goes wrong while we're on the road. But AAA, not just a name to know when it comes to that roadside assistance. They're also a name to know when it comes to the vehicle that you have on the road, because they are a great option when it comes to your insurance needs, your home insurance, your auto insurance. And when it comes to auto insurance, when you switch and save to AAA, you have a chance to put a whole lot more money back in your process because of that obviously you're going to get a great product here, and there's a 93% satisfaction rate on all of that. So they're clearly doing something right if they've got that many people who are that happy with the auto insurance product they provide. So make sure you find out more about this by give them a call. 833-718-2075. That's 833-718-2075. Find a branch near you and find out about the great options that exist for you when it comes to AAA for your auto insurance. So, Jeff, a little bit of online chatter as of late as it relates to David Hobbs, the four-star defensive lineman. It seems like that's a name we've talked about a lot here recently, and when we've discussed this before, it seems like there's potentially good news for Georgia. It sort of seems like as of late, if the social media discussion of the internet is to be believed, it's not quite as good for Georgia and Hobbs anymore. Is that the read that you get on this, that maybe Georgia might be turning away here with a defensive lineman of note?
Quite a defensive lineman of note. Georgia had the last offer. Always, to my mind, to make this kind of simple, Tennessee, Georgia kind of saw him as the Trayvon Walker role, kind of the same build, kind of the same athlete. Tennessee has kind of been in his hot spot or that warm and fuzzy feeling for quite some time. I do think he really likes Georgia. I do think he really likes the relationship he's built with a couple of Georgia commitments and also Trey Scott. Because let's just face it, Coach Scott he's a unique animal right now for Georgia in the recruiting sphere for recruiting defensive linemen. I think that's the thing where I think he's committing in honor of his mother's birthday on the 25th. Getting really close, man. You see Turkey Day and you see big commitments and everything else like that. That's a situation there where Tennessee is looming. I think Georgia's looming. He's going to say good things about North Carolina. He's going to say good things about Alabama. He's going to say good things about Ohio State. Might be a case there where, let's just remind ourselves, you're going to call it bad news, but I would also say for every action on the recruiting trail, especially this late, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And Georgia adds Davian Hobbs, so to speak, and then I think it gets a little muddier water for who's going to be that, what you're trying to do with Jordan Big Baby Hall and what you're trying to do with Damon Wilson and what you're trying to do with Samuel Mpemba and a lot of those guys. I think it gets a little complicated because a lot of those guys are seeing it as I might be a Trayvon Walker type, I might be that edge rusher type, I might be that pass rusher defensive lineman extraordinaire, kind of like some of the things that Trayvon used to do for Georgia and Michael is doing for Georgia right now. And it might be a situation where a Hobbs loss might be offset with better news on another front.
Well, that's certainly something to think about, and good stuff there, Jeff, and a nice way to close things off. Appreciate that. We'll see you tonight, Peachtree TV, for a big one in round 2 of the 7A state playoffs as Buford hosts Walton. All kinds of great prospects on both sides of the field for both these teams, so we'll look forward to doing that. We haven't even gotten to the 2024 prospects, by the way, which litter the lineup there for Buford there as well. So we're looking forward to that. Jeff, we'll see you then, and then traveling to Lexington tomorrow. Going to be a fun weekend of football. Thanks for being here on the road, assisted by AAA here today.
Hey, Brandon, one thing. I want to share one quick story. You mentioned 2024s, and if you let me do it, I'll let you have the first hour of radio control on the way up to Lexington where we can play all the hits you want to hear. But 2024 class, it's coming up on DawgNation.com this morning, a little early this afternoon. But love stories like this. This is a young man at Tucker High School, Brandon, C.J. Jackson. He has no rankings. He has no pages, but he has some tremendous junior film. Brandon, you're going to find this hard to believe. He was actually at Parkview last year with Mike Matthews and, all those really strong players, Jalen Crawford, Simpson, all those players that were there on that roster last year. He gets an offer from Georgia yesterday at about 8 p.m. last night. No stars. He had one previous offer from Indiana, but 6'5", 6'4.5", with the shoes off, 220 at 11 sacks. Great burst, great length, great tape. Brandon, it's the best time of year when that film gets evaluated. He's just a junior, Brandon. He's going to go from no stars and unranked to probably a 5-star. He's already getting offers to All-American games when earlier this week he was just hoping he could get an offer, something maybe bigger and greater than the Indiana Hoosiers. Love stories like this. Georgia is now in this recruitment big already. out of nowhere, and that's why I do what I do and why I love what I do and why you guys need to hear about it. Because all of a sudden, Brandon, you're going to go, your little Rain Man computer in your head's going to go, hold on a second, Edge, 2024 class. Georgia's got a lot of guys they already like. Well, Brandon, this guy goes up right in the middle of the top of the food chain of all that. C.J. Jackson, in-state guy at Tucker High School. Great story coming on DawgNation.com.
Jeff, that's great stuff. Thanks for being here. We'll see you tonight.
See you guys. Take it easy.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So one of the things that Jeff was saying a moment ago that kind of gets me thinking here a little bit, and this is one of those deals where honesty sort of compels you to admit that, it is thought that Tennessee's a factor in Hobbs' recruitment. And, yeah, last week Florida did flip Rashad away from Miami, the quarterback. And, yeah, Florida's thought to be a pretty big factor in the running back that just decommitted from Ohio State. And we had the report yesterday from Chris Lowe. We think that came, from Lane Kiffin himself about the NIL fund that exists at Auburn right now, too. That I don't know that you see a lot of this right now, the 2023 class. And this is not, what's wrong with Georgia recruiting? Because I think that Georgia's going to do just fine no matter what. I really do. I'm just saying that I would say when it comes to class of 2024, when it comes to sort of future years, I do think that you're going to see more of Georgia's recruiting rivals a little more well-armed when it comes to the NIL stuff. Auburn hasn't chosen to use any of its NIL resources just simply because I don't think they wanted to give Brian Harsin any help because I don't think they like Brian Harsin. That's fairly easy to determine. And, Tennessee seems to be building up its NIL arsenal at kind of the right time. They're playing better on the field, and they may now have some NIL support to kind of, provide additional backup on all of that. And, pretty clearly Florida thinks it can be a player in this. And in the head-to-head stuff they've kind of done with Miami, in the case of Rashada getting the win here, maybe evidence to point to the fact that's actually true. So I think that when it comes to the Georgia recruiting rivals that you've seen the Dogs kind of beating up on in recent years, I do think you're going to see them attempt to dip more heavily into the NIL pool for future recruiting battles. And that's going to have – I don't know that it changes the results. Georgia may continue to win just as much as it is, and frankly it's obviously well-positioned to do that. But I think it's going to probably change the way that some of these battles are fought in the future, especially in the case of Auburn, who's really not a factor in recruiting at all right now. But if the NIL stuff is to be believed, and if they really do want to step up and support their next coach, then you may see them be a factor in a way they haven't. You're kind of seeing Florida right now be a factor in a way that it hasn't. And you have the makings of Tennessee being certainly more of a factor now than you probably have seen them be in maybe quite some time. So just something to kind of file away there, that as you start thinking ahead to 2024 cycle and late stages of 2023 certainly here too, you're talking about NIL and Georgia rivals in a way that maybe you haven't in the past. So just something to think about there. Something else to think about, cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And boy, you've heard me say it this week already, but this kind of weather, when it's freezing cold outside, it makes me wish I was on the Caribbean right now. Looking forward to some Royal Caribbean cruise vacations here coming up. Can't wait to tell you about Wonder of the Seas. Get a chance to sail on that here very soon. The largest cruise ship in the world. A chance to experience that and tell you what it's all about, and I can't wait to do so. And obviously, we're also thinking about April coming up there as well with our own DawgNation cruise there too. You are a part of that. April 24th to the 28th, leaving from Port Canaveral, going to Nassau in the Bahamas, going to Perfect Day Coco Cay, doing all of that. And we want you to invite you to be a part of it. You can check out royaldogs.com. That's royaldogs.com. That's a website specially designed by our friend Jessica Slater, great travel agent who Royal Caribbean has specially selected for us to be a part of this and help you get booked up to be a part of that with us. You can also just call Jessica directly at 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147, and you can find out about all the great things associated with our DawgNation cruise, the special events only for those a part of this with DawgNation, the fun stuff that everybody gets to do on Independence and Seas, and some great stuff related to the ports we're visiting, those shore excursions and all those fun things. Jessica can tell you all about that, and she'll even tell you about the debut of Icon of the Seas coming up in January of 2024. It's going to be an unbelievable new chapter in kind of the cruise vacation story and setting a new standard with each and every ship that's introduced into the fleet. That's obviously what Royal Caribbean's famous for, and this will be no doubt true with Icon of the Seas there as well. So we'll have some picks here coming up in a moment. Before that, though, I want to follow up a little bit on something we talked about yesterday. So we talked about a report from Chris Lowe, ESPN reporter, We thought this was kind of a direct statement by Lane Kiffin through Chris Lowe. We obviously can't prove that, but this had all the trappings of that Kiffin might be interested in the Auburn job because of the NIL stuff I was mentioning a moment ago. And then whether it's coincidentally or as a response to all of that, there was also some reporting coming out of Oxford, Mississippi yesterday that Ole Miss might be ready to step up big as a way to try to keep Kiffin employed there. Let me show you a tweet here from Richard Cross. Richard Cross, longtime guy connected to the Ole Miss program. I know Richard a little bit. He's deeply entrenched there in Oxford. This is what Richard writes this week on Twitter. Yesterday he wrote this. Lane Kiffin has received a new contract offer from Ole Miss that would make him one of the 10 highest paid coaches in college football. It's now a waiting game to see if he will receive an offer from Auburn. More details on this on his radio show, he says. So if you don't mind, hold this up there on the screen for a moment. The wording here is kind of interesting, that Kiffin has received the offer. It's not that Kiffin's expected to sign it or anything like that, but Ole Miss wanted to be out in front in making a big contract offer. And obviously potential interest from Auburn is the motivating force here. And sometimes you see coaches kind of use the offer from somebody else to get the bigger contract where they are right now. And it's just simply not obvious what Kiffin's going to do on this because there are some rumors out there that Kiffin might be holding out for a chance to replace Nick Saban in Alabama. I don't know that Alabama would want Kiffin. That seems a little bit, I don't know what for them, but there's some thought they might want to do that. Certainly Lane Kiffin and Nick Saban are still incredibly close. We know that as a fact, and maybe Saban would vouch for Kiffin for a job like that. So that's kind of out there a little bit. But it's also the thought of, hey, at some point in time, Auburn's going to probably express some interest, but Ole Miss says, before all that happens, boom, here's a big contract offer for you. We want to step up a financial way that we've never done before and make you one of the 10 highest paid coaches in college football. So let me tell you what all this kind of means to me. Is next Thursday is the Egg Bowl. And the Egg Bowl is always like as much of a drama farm as anything can be. And it's even going to be more so this year because on the Starkville side of all of this, and having been there last week, I have a little bit more insight into this. They're fed up with Mike Leach. They just are. And, you know, Leach is one of those guys that because he's funny and quirky or whatever else, Leach always has his supporters in the media because the media just sort of likes the stuff about him that makes him go against the grain. A lot of media folks really like Leach. Not everybody does, but a lot of them do. But the Mississippi State fans themselves are just getting a little bit tired. Now, you can say, well, that's improper expectations. This is a typical Mississippi State season. Maybe it is, but, you know, Leach lost in the Egg Bowl last year. If you lose the Egg Bowl again this year, and keep in mind, going back to his time at Washington State coach, like the one thing that Leach never did was he virtually never beat Washington. He was very bad in rivalry games, very bad in games against teams that had a little bit of a recruiting advantage, but also very bad in those rivalry games. And that has kind of continued here thus far in Starkville there as well. So I don't think Mississippi State can fire Leach after this season, but you could certainly see the seeds planted to move off of Mike Leach if another Egg Bowl goes badly. So you got unhappy people on the Starkville side of this. And on the Oxford side of this, you're going to have a lot of genuine intrigue and drama about whether or not Lane Kiffin's coming back next year. And Kiffin can end all of this by, if this contract offer is real, and Richard's pretty plugged in, I have every reason to believe that he's probably right about this, Kiffin can end all of this drama by simply announcing that he's staying at Ole Miss, signing the contract, and it would probably be smart to do this going into the Egg Bowl as a way of either building some momentum if you do win, or maybe kind of softening the blow if you don't. It'd be kind of smart to do this prior to that if you are going to do it. But folks, if that doesn't come out before Thanksgiving night, then you have to look at the real possibility that Kiffin is very much in play for that Auburn job. You say, what about Cadillac Williams? I don't know. I'm going to have more on that in a moment. But just sort of keep in mind here that that there is a lot of drama brewing with the Egg Bowl game coming up on Thursday, and most of that's on the Ole Miss side, where Kiffin's gotten the contract offer to stay at Ole Miss. The overtures from Auburn seem to be pretty real, although they haven't gotten too specific as of yet. So that gets to be pretty interesting there, right there. Now, with all that said, let's make some picks for the week. Give you some thoughts on the games here. Most of these have college football playoff implications here. We'll start with Georgia and Kentucky. I'm going to give you two notes here on the Georgia-Kentucky game, where 22.5, according to our friends at MyBookie. So on the one hand, you may be aware of the fact that Georgia's actually failed to cover in its last 3 games against the Wildcats, including the last trip here to Lexington in 2020. Basically it was a garbage time touchdown for for Kentucky last year that prevented the Georgia cover, but nonetheless it was a point spread cover for the Cats. So Georgia 0-3 in its last 3 against the spread when it comes to Kentucky. However, in the previous 3 before that with Kirby Smart, they had covered against the Wildcats, including a dominant win against a ranked Kentucky team in Lexington in 2018. So it's not exactly fair to say that Georgia has had long-standing issues with the Wildcats. They've just failed to cover their last 3. But beyond that, and this is a really interesting number here, and the Missouri game that we talked about earlier in the show is kind of the only outlier in this discussion. Georgia's actually 7-2 in its last 9 games in the Kirby Smart era when on the road and favored by more than 20 points. A dominant performance for Georgia on the road here, looking at a 20-point plus spread working against them, and yet Georgia's finding a way to cover that big number far more often than not. I still sort of think 22 and a half is kind of a lot here. I told you it was a lot of points last week against Mississippi State. I turned out to be wrong. But there's still something in me here who says, hey, maybe this game is inside of 3 touchdowns on Saturday. Maybe it's another late Kentucky score like it was a year ago. I don't think Kentucky's a real threat to win this game. I truly don't. I don't think Georgia fans going to have a ton to be worried about based on the way the game is played. But for me, speaking as a fan for a moment, this is kind of another one of those deals where I think a win is sort of enough for me. Just check the box and move on. With that in mind, 22 and a half, kind of a lot here. So just be really, really careful before you take Georgia minus such a big spread, even though the trend suggests that Georgia will handle its business because that's what it's been doing, but when favored by more than 20 on the road. Tennessee, also a big favorite on the road, too, at South Carolina. Keep in mind, this is a spot earlier this year where Georgia won, 48-7, so maybe a little bit of a comparison game with this Tennessee team that still thinks of itself as a playoff contender. Here's what I will tell you. A game that you probably didn't pay any attention to last week at all, I think is kind of pretty revealing for a game like this. South Carolina was awful against Florida. Not only did they give up way too much defensively, but they didn't move the football at all against the Gators defense that I think you already know is pretty terrible. And I love Shane Beamer. I think that Shane Beamer is a good coach, but also the kind of coach that's good for the SEC. I like Beamer a lot. This was not good last week, though, down in Gainesville. And you say, well, maybe they're ready to come back home and play better here. Maybe they are, but it's also potential indication they just don't have it. They may just not have it right now. Spencer Rattler's not had a good season. They may just not have it right now. And if you're looking for evidence that Tennessee really is much improved compared to a year ago and truly a playoff level worthy type team, the point spread, maybe all the data, the information you need on this falls 8-2 against the number so far this year. So I'll take Tennessee minus the 21.5. I don't typically take that big a spread for a road team, but in this particular case, I probably will. I'll also take Michigan minus the 17.5 against Illinois. On balance, this point spread should be lower than this. On the basis of the full season, Illinois has played better than a 17.5 point underdog at Michigan on Saturday. But there's a lot of recency bias that creeps in here. The Illini have looked really bad their last 2 games. And suddenly, what at one point in time seemed like a given, the fact that Illinois would win the Big Ten West, that doesn't quite seem that way as much anymore. And I like Brett Bielema as a coach, but Michigan's actually been humming along pretty good for most of the season. This is a fairly significant step up in competition based, compared to what they mostly have been playing. But nonetheless, I think Michigan minus the 17.5 is worth the flyer here. I wouldn't bet this game, but I'll pick the game. And Michigan minus 17.5 is my pick. TCU is against Baylor. The Horned Frogs, despite being undefeated, despite being once again ranked in the top 4 by the College Ball Playoff Selection Committee, find themselves just a 3-point favorite on the road against a Baylor team that got blown out last week. There is a lot of skepticism within the gambling community as it relates to TCU. TCU makes them look wrong, and me included, every single week. They were a touchdown underdog to Texas last week. They won the game. They played well defensively, something they haven't really done prior to that this season. And yet, nonetheless, the disbelief is back for this game against Baylor. And I'm going to join the fray on this. I'm going to take Baylor plus the 3 to end the magical season for TCU, or at least keep it within that number with a real shot to win outright. TCU on the road, playoff hopes hanging by a string as a very narrow, very narrow favorite here on the road. We'll certainly keep our eye on that. Baylor the pick there. And then USC is at UCLA. You kind of know the story here. UCLA ruined what would have been a great game, at least from a playoff implication standpoint, by losing last week to Arizona. USC going on the road here, just essentially traveling across town to Pasadena, just a 1.5 favorite. Big running back injury for USC is actually the number one story to be aware of when it comes to the Trojans here on this spot. But even with that, I'm still going to take the Lincoln Riley's club here on the simple basis of this. I believe that if USC keeps winning, they're going to make the college football playoff. And you can say what you want about Riley's teams back at Oklahoma when they got to the playoff. They were obviously embarrassed more often than not, and they handled their business pretty well against Georgia, but still lost the game in 2017. But no matter what you want to say about what happens to Riley's teams in the playoff, he has shown a remarkable ability to get to the playoff. Won 8 straight to conclude the 2017 regular season to make the college football playoff, 6 straight in 2018, and another 5 in a row to wrap things up in 2019. All of those winning streaks resulting in appearance in the college football playoff. When the opportunity is there to put some wins together to get into the postseason, that's what Riley's proven capable of doing, and that'll give the nod to him from me for this game against UCLA on Saturday. And kind of a look there at some of the big picks there for the weekend. One more thing to kind of mention on a completely different note. There are a couple of these like SEC teams playing against like sort of what you kind of think of as nondescript opponents on Saturday that should not escape your attention either. I'd keep my eye on LSU UAB a little bit here. But beyond that, I would definitely keep my eye on Auburn. Hosting Western Kentucky on Saturday. They are just a 5.5-point favorite against the Hilltoppers. And frankly, I think that Auburn may be lucky to win this game. This is one of those deals where there was a lot of emotion expended last week in the win against Texas A&M. We know how silly that is because A&M's terrible. Auburn's not very good either. And yet there has been a real rallying around Cadillac Williams as of late. And I get it. I think Cadillac comes across as a pretty good dude. I certainly think that he's earned a very bright future in the coaching ranks for himself based on the way he's handled these last couple of weeks. But here's the thing you got to understand, is across the board this year, we've seen a lot of coaches fired. We've seen a lot of interim coaches, and almost all those interim coaches have had at least a little bit of initial success. Take a look at Brent Key at Georgia Tech, for instance, on this. Tech, worst team in the country at one point, and yet you fire Jeff Collins, you hire Brent Key, you win a couple of games just like that. Interim coaches are kind of having some success in college football. Cadillac Williams fits into the mold on that. They're 2-0 against the spread since he's taken over the Auburn job. They won outright against Texas A&M last week. But also consider, in almost every situation where interim coaches have had their moment has not lasted. They early bounce, early momentum. By that third game, it almost completely disappears. Almost like the old Cinderella thing of kind of turning into a pumpkin. That's almost exactly what all of this has had happen. And I think for Auburn against Western Kentucky on Saturday, you better be very, very careful. In fact, I like the Hilltoppers plus 5.5 here. That's not the only SEC team that I think could be very, very dangerous in a tricky spot as it kind of hosts one of these kind of cupcake-type teams ahead of rivalry weekend next weekend. Auburn may be the most interesting name there on that list, but by far the only one. It will make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. By the way, speaking of point spreads and picks on games, if you want to get your own picks down on some big games of the weekend, our friends at MyBookie can certainly give you an opportunity to do that. It's winning season at MyBookie. So what that means is just simply find MyBookie online, just type it into your browser, use the promo code DawgNation, and you can get a big deposit bonus. That means you put in $400, they're going to double that for you. You're going to put in $400 there yourself, so you got $800 in your account right away. They'll do this for you up to $1,000. Then after that, you win, you play, you get paid. It's as simple as that with MyBookie, whether it be, college action throughout the week, NFL stuff coming up on Sundays, obviously the full slate of college football tomorrow. A lot of chances for you to get down some big bets and have a good time doing so. Our friends at MyBookie allow you to do that, but you got to use the promo code DawgNation to take advantage of all of that. Of course, the weekend around here means that we're excited about being on the weekend. Not quite as warm as we typically like weekends to be, but nonetheless, we're excited about it, and we like to celebrate that, what we call our Big Finish, presented by the Finish Long Drink here. And so many of you have enjoyed the Finish Long Drink throughout the years here, and every now and then we like to give kind of a little bit of a blast from the past, a little bit of a throwback to folks maybe trying the Finish Long Drink for the first time and realizing how fun and enjoyable that can be. So let's shout out our Big Finish here for a moment. Cliff Cawley sent this to us back in the summertime, but I tried this for the first time, and Long Drink is delicious. Cliff, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad that you and so many folks here connected to DawgNation have given the Finish Long Drink a try. And if you haven't done it yet, but you want to, you can find it online, thelongdrink.com, and you can hear about the entire product line there. Cliff tries the cranberry. But in addition to that, there's the Long Drink Strong, which is 8.5% alcohol by volume. Long Drink Zero, no carbs, no sugar. The traditional in the blue can that has the grapefruit flavor, the gin kick. You can get all of that online, thelongdrink.com, for a lot more on that. So with that said, we'll get ready to wrap things up and get ready to take things towards Lexington, Kentucky on Saturday. And we'll do so in style here with a great number of golden shoes. Our golden shoes for this particular day, and I would say for all the days in the foreseeable future, all built around the theme of hashtag Go for Two in 22. And I'm just simply kind of going through Twitter and kind of looking at all the folks using the hashtag and trying to give a few shout outs here on that. So that's kind of our theme here for our golden shoe right now, including our first one. Seth Rhodes says, this is how Florida and Tennessee Kirby compared to how Kirby really is obviously the funny video game character, and he gets the hashtag Go for Two in 22, and yeah, that scary looking face. You better believe the Florida Gators and the Tennessee Vols see Kirby that way. So good stuff by Seth Rhodes, and good use of the hashtag Go for Two in 22. Jay Napolitano also says, if the Buc-ee's in Birmingham is any indication, we may have a Georgia takeover in Starkville. He said this last week. That pretty much turned out to be true, and he also used the hashtag Go for Two in 22. Appreciate that, Jay. A couple more to give you here there as well. He also kind of shows you the scene there on hand with the Go for Two in 22 and dogs traveling indeed, and we saw plenty of that. And then Colorado Dog says, can't wait to add another tombstone here on Sunday. Looking at all those opponents that Georgia's beaten and also giving the hashtag Go for Two in 22. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. I'm just going to kind of be going through Twitter and looking for the folks using that hashtag and continuing to give those shots out as a part of our golden shoe here right now. And that is all great to see. And by the way, speaking of the lousy, stinking Gators, who somebody mentioned before, back in Jacksonville 344 days from right now. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. We'll see all of you on Monday. Enjoy the game. We'll talk to you next week right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews is one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They will show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. We love them for all of that. We're going to get some of your comments here coming up in a moment. We're also a couple of minutes away here as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. I'm talking to Ella Dorsey from Atlanta News First. Ella going to give us a little bit of information on just how cold it's going to be in Lexington on Saturday. Ella's no fan of the cold weather, as nor am I, and so we'll see if we can endure that here this weekend, and more importantly, can the Dogs endure that and get the big win against Kentucky? So we'll talk about all that here coming up. And while we await Ella's appearance, we'll have time for your comments here too. Let me go over to YouTube here for a moment. We'll bring up the YouTube folks and let them have their talk and their chatter, and we'll do all that here right now. Kirby's Belt talking about visiting the Buc-ee's. It really is amazing just what a cultural institution that's become as quickly as it kind of has. And I mean, my family, we're the same way. I'm personally in the same way. You know, if we're traveling, depending on where you go, you kind of stop in Calhoun or Fort Valley or Leeds or wherever. You're just kind of going to one of those Buc-ee's there. And in Leeds on Saturday, two things happened. I've told you this before. When I got out of the car at that Buc-ee's right there just outside of Birmingham, first of all, I was shocked at how quickly it had gotten so cold, because when I left the house, it was like normal weather, you know, like kind of Georgia fall weather where it was like warm enough that you had the air conditioning on and you weren't wearing a ton of extra layers. And yet when I got to that Buc-ee's, it was freezing, and it only got colder as we got closer and closer to Starkville. And she's ready to go? Okay, and obviously just freezing cold, and there are Georgia fans everywhere, all over the place. So that was quite an experience, and so I'm glad Georgia fans enjoyed that there too. And by the way, speaking of being freezing cold, we all expect to be in Kentucky on Saturday to be shivering to death. And Ella Dorsey from Atlanta News First going to tell us more about that right now. Ella, how you been? Glad to have you back in the program. Hope you're doing well.
Brandon, are you staying warm? Because I'm not. It is cold outside. You and I were talking yesterday, and you were like, I am not made for this cold. No. You know, your fingers hurt. Your nose runs. Yep. It doesn't feel like football weather. No. Last week, the game in Mississippi State was cold. If you're going to Kentucky this weekend, it's going to be even colder than that game in Starkville. So I just looked up the numbers, the most current numbers. By the way, right now in Lexington, it's snowing.
Oh, my gosh.
So don't be surprised if you see some flurries on the ground. Tomorrow morning, temperatures will start out in the teens.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. Look on your face.
I don't like it, Ella.
Yeah. So the morning low is 18 degrees. And it's going to be really breezy. It will be sunny, but that breeze is going to bite. So noon, the temperature is 33 degrees.
Wow.
And it feels like 23. So pregame is going to be very cold. For kickoff, it's 38 degrees. It feels like 30. And by the end of the game, the sun will have set. So, the second half, you're not going to have the sun at all. And when that sun goes down behind the stadium, it's going to start to feel really cold. By 6 p.m., it's back to 33 degrees. It feels like 25. Wow. So you need all the extra layers, right? Like I would bring hand warmers if I were you, gloves, hat, scarf. It's just going to be really cold. It's going to be really cold. It's cold enough that might impact the play. I think up in Kentucky, they're a little bit more used to the cold, not quite as used to it as, some of those Big Ten teams, but it's certainly going to be very cold tomorrow. I bet you, for all of you who are going to watch it from home, at some point, the guys that are announcing the game are going to say something about how cold it is outside. You're going to see the breath. You're going to see Kirby I don't know. Does Kirby even bundle up? I feel like he wears a sweatshirt even when it's like 10 degrees outside.
I was going to tell you this. It was actually one of the things I was the most impressed with last week, because one of the things we do is we'll kind of video the team getting off the bus, kind of walking towards the stadium. And I'm always kind of interested in the body language, like the game faces and stuff like that. But last week in particular, I was very interested in kind of what the look of the team was. I wanted to see how many extra layers I saw, because as you said, Georgia's got players from South Florida and Nevada, and even guys from Georgia, didn't play high school games in particularly cold weather very much. And so I was just kind of curious for these guys who are not really used to very much cold weather, what do they look like walking into the stadium? Because over the years, I've seen some teams that just didn't want it in the cold weather. It's one of those things where that's just not mentally what you're prepared to handle. But I didn't see this from Georgia last week. I didn't see the overcoats as they were walking into the stadium. I didn't really see anybody shivering or anything like that, Kirby included, but certainly the players themselves. It did not seem to impact the way they warmed up prior to the game. In fact, a lot of those guys weren't even wearing like the sleeves underneath their jersey. So I got to give the team itself credit for as cold as it was, and last week was very cold. As you said, this week even colder, but it was cold last week in Starkville, and yet visually, I never really saw Georgia act like they really even noticed. So I do have to give them credit for how they handled that last week, because the honest truth is they seemed to process it pretty well, even though it was a very different thing than what most of them were used to.
And also, you underestimated them a little bit last week. You went with the under, and what was the final score?
They won by 26, right? 45 to whatever. Yeah,
math
never
thought
my
it was
strong
going to be
suit.
a close game. It was pretty close to the first half.
Yep.
Right. So through the first half, I was like, okay, Brandon really did his research, man. He really knows what he's talking about. And then we just took it away third quarter.
Yeah, that's right.
I will say, it's been really cold here this entire week, and they've been practicing in the cold. So that should help some. It's not going to come as a complete shock. Their bodies are going to be, a little bit used to the cold just because we've had 5 days of it now. But it's still, I think, for at least the fans, it's really going to be an impactful part of the game day weekend. So just bring hot cocoa, bring hand warmers, all of the necessary stuff, the extra socks, the wool socks if you have them, and you'll be fine.
Well, let me ask you this, because you mentioned breezy before, and taking this away from like the comfort part of this, like the one thing that I've had like quarterbacks tell me and other players tell me is, hey, the one thing that really does impact the way you play the game is actually wind. Some people think it's rain, but it's actually more so wind than rain. So when you say breezy, is it breezy enough that, and maybe we just don't know, certainly I don't know, but is it breezy enough that you might actually call it windy? Because if it's windy, that does, I think, have the chance to kind of impact the way this game is played tomorrow.
So usually what we say is when gusts get up to about 30 miles per hour, we'll say it's windy. Tomorrow it looks like sustained winds about 15 miles per hour, gusts between 22 to 25. So it's going to borderline. It's going to feel windy just because it's so cold. Is it actually considered windy? Not really. And the wind is actually going to be coming out of the south.
Okay.
Usually when you get that wind, that really gusty breeze, it's coming out of the north. So that might add a little bit, make it a little bit less impactful. And I don't know which way the stadium stands, and so I don't know, if it faces northwest versus, if it faces east-west versus north-south, that southerly wind might be able to get into the stadium a little bit more. I'm not sure what the Kentucky Stadium looks like, but I wouldn't say it's going to be windy, but it's going to be breezy enough that they are really going to feel it on the field for sure.
Well, let's finish with this because you mentioned, Georgia actually last week probably handled business. I expected them to win the game, but they handled business last week better even than I thought they did. How confident do you feel in Georgia right now? I mean, in one respect, it certainly seems like this team is humming along here pretty good, kind of biding its time, waiting for the SEC championship, obviously the chance to be back in the college football playoff. All seems to sort of be well in the world here right now. You feeling pretty good about these dogs here at the moment?
I've never been more confident in a Georgia team. And I will tell you, at the beginning of last year, and my team here, Rodney and Courtney, Rodney can tell you, he's worked with me for 6 years. I was not confident last year.
Okay.
I was not. At the beginning of the season, I was like, there's no way. I just think we've shown consistency on and off the field more than we ever have before. And really, there's not, you look at the other top teams and they're not as well-rounded as Georgia is. So certainly, Kentucky is a decent team. We have to keep our heads down, and then we have Tech. But I think right now probably all eyes are on the SEC championship. And is LSU a team that can beat Georgia? At this point, it's kind of like it doesn't really seem like that's going to happen.
Sure.
So I'm really excited about it. The SEC championship is going to be on Atlanta News First.
Mm-hmm.
And I just got word a couple of days ago that I'm going to be helping host the post-game show. So I'm going to be outside
awesome.
the bins. Yeah, like meeting with fans, doing dances, partying after the game, hopefully.
That's great.
So that's really excited. So I'm really only thinking about December 3rd, 4th right now,
I know that. Well, that's good stuff. Well, Ella, it's always great to have you here. And you mentioned the team there, Atlanta News First. You guys also have a great show that you guys are doing there each and every morning, and frankly, keeping folks up to date as they're going to high school football games tonight and all the other stuff there as well. You guys are always doing a great job with that. So remind folks so they can see you on TV and all the great things that you and the entire team there at Atlanta News First are doing.
Yes, which now is it's about to be a team of 7 meteorologists.
Wow.
So the largest in the market. 4:30 to 7 every morning. If you are a late riser, we are also on 9 to 10 a.m. every morning. We have a lot of fun. Hope you'll tune in. Brand new studio. We hired 50 new employees this year. It feels completely different. The news is the highest quality news product I've ever been a part of. And it's not just, the mug shots and that kind of awful news. It's fun news and good news and news that you turn off the TV and you feel good about, right? Which feels a little different. So we hope that you'll tune in and check us out.
We definitely will. Ella, enjoy the games this weekend. We'll look forward to talking to you soon, and we'll see you in Atlanta for the SEC Championship coming up there as well.
Yes. Okay. Bye, Brandon.
Good stuff there from Ella Dorsey, Atlanta News First, doing a great job. And we'll get some of your comments here really quickly and get ready to bounce out of here there as well because we got a very, very busy weekend here coming up. Let's get ready to get going here. Did some YouTube comments earlier. We'll go to DawgNation.com, do a couple of comments over there, get ready to bounce out of here there as well. JP on the subject of LSU, we're talking about the SEC championship a moment ago. He says LSU's one-dimensional. He says they're leading passers, they're leading rusher, tells you a lot. He says if you affect Jaden Daniels, you win the game easily. And, could be that simple. It certainly could be that simple. Certainly it's been hard to get Kirby Smart to want to talk about the SEC championship as of yet, but that doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. And obviously all systems kind of pointing towards that for Georgia here coming up. Johnny Surfdog says it was also cold in Jacksonville this weekend, which you hate to hear because you sort of think about that Florida First Coast sort of being sort of toasty and warm all the time, but apparently this weekend that's not it. Bill Russell asked a really good question. He says, in terms of confidence, who wants to play UGA? And I would say that that's a great way to think about this in that, for those of us who sort of see this through the perspective of Georgia, we can't really know how the season's going to end for Georgia. We can't guarantee a championship, but I can guarantee you this, that I would say that any team out there would almost rather play any other team than have to play Georgia. That's just the one that you don't want to play. And that doesn't mean, that means that Georgia's definitely going to win, but it does mean you're doing something right if that's indeed the case. Ken Holcomb says Dog is going to kick the Cats right out of their own sandbox tomorrow. He says Dogs by at least 25. Even though the Cats have a good defense, it's going to be cold. So he's feeling pretty good about that. Randy Hall feeling pretty good about a wave of upcoming commitments there too, which you'd love to see. We'll bounce over here and get some Facebook comments, and we'll get ready to get out of here. Let's get ready to do that. Always a little slow to load. Wayne Kirkland says there's no doubt that Georgia's the new standard right now, and I would say that is indeed the case. Ryan Walker, Miriam Corbin having some fun here. Eric DeVorncy saying, I just hope that Georgia stays healthy. Injuries become a big factor here right now. I mentioned the USC. I apologize for not remembering the guy's name because he's obviously been a very good player this year, but USC's missing a key running back on Saturday. That's a massive injury in that game, and it changes the way I believe that USC plays. So this is one of those deals where you kind of hope you're like Georgia, where you're getting injured players back healthy. Georgia recently got Jalen Carter back, still hopes to get A.D. Mitchell back. But also, a lot of this college football playoff drama is going to be also influenced by somebody's injury that's to come. And some team somewhere is going to have a big one here at some point in time. And if you're Georgia, you just hope it's not you. Matt Rukavina's funny stuff, as always. Let's see what else. Daniel Aldridge says Stetson's finally getting some recognition he deserves, as is UGA as a team. And that's exactly right. There is a team concept in place at Georgia that makes it harder for any individual player to get the kind of attention that he might get playing somewhere else. And yet the Georgia guys seem to enjoy that because they seem to genuinely enjoy playing with each other. So I think you're kind of right about that. Let's see what else. Final comments because we got to get ready to go. Jacob O'Neill checking out. Jacob, glad to have you here. Anything else on Facebook before we bounce out of here? Looks like a pretty good conversation is being had. How about YouTube one final time? Scott Pete looking back on the 76 Georgia-Kentucky. I've heard about that. I'm obviously not able to remember that game. Wasn't alive for that game. But I've heard big things about Georgia-Kentucky in 76. And also, Kentucky was the team that Georgia played when Prince Charles, and he's now the king, I guess, but when Prince Charles came to Athens, Georgia was playing Kentucky for that game too, right? So you got a little bit of a interesting history with Georgia and Kentucky. The great Munson call on the one field goal. Was that 78? Was that the Munson call? The yeah. Was that 78? Kind of that sort of pre-Herschel era of Georgia. Scott Boland says that Buc-ee's is 100% parent tax for me, $100 parent tax for me when I travel. Yeah, kids love Buc-ee's. There's no question about that. They love Buc-ee's. Curtis Jackson says dogs catching fire at the right time. Kirby and the staff of the team are ready for battle every week. That's a great way to say that and a great way to end our week. Of course, check out the AJC online, ajc.com. You know the World Cup is beginning? It's kind of funny. I was listening to this little World Cup chatter the other day, and I realized, gosh, I guess I know more soccer players than I realized because I played FIFA with my son, and so they were talking about some soccer player for some country. And I was like, I know who that guy is because you play this FIFA game enough, you start learning some of these soccer players. So I'm sure you'll get plenty of World Cup coverage online with the AJC. Also, special series debuts on the AJC on Sunday, looking at kind of dangerous apartment complexes and why so many of those remain dangerous, and what it means for the people who live in those. A very important report, very important study. You can get more on that online, ajc.com. Also, getting ready to start seeing some holiday lights and things like that. A gamer convention in town too, so some fun stuff for the weekend there as well. Previewing the weekend online with the ajc.com. Also, big thanks to R.S. Andrews, making the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. R.S. Andrews is one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. Y'all have a great weekend, and don't forget to reach out to R.S. Andrews if your water heater goes out or something like that, because they can replace it for you the same day. You can trust them on that. And we'll see you in Lexington on Saturday, tonight on Peachtree TV. Back here Monday for DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to talking to you then, everybody.